Myatka, Burma, August 1944. In the aftermath of the American recapture of Myatka on August 10, 1944, following a grueling 78-day siege, USR forces uncovered evidence that would mark the first systematic documentation of Japan's wartime sexual slavery network, known as the Comfort Women System. During operations, 20 Korean women and 2 Japanese civilians who managed the comfort stations were taken into custody, the Psychological Warfare Division of the U.S. Office of War Information carried out interrogations that were subsequently compiled as Japanese Prisoner of War Interrogation Report No. 49. This document represented the first official American record detailing what would later be recognized as one of the largest organized systems of sexual exploitation in modern history. The women recounted being recruited in Korea in 1942 with promises of employment in Singapore's factories. Instead, they were transported through Rangoon to the Burmese frontier, where they were systematically forced into sexual servitude. The report, declassified in 1973, outlined their living conditions, operational procedures, and the highly organized nature of these comfort stations, the euphemistic term employed by the Japanese military. As Allied forces advanced across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the scale of the system gradually became apparent. Historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki would later catalogue nearly 2,000 comfort stations spanning territories from China to the Dutch East Indies, involving roughly 200,000 women coerced into sexual slavery. From the dense jungles of Burma to the devastated cities of Manila, from the rugged mountains of China to scattered islands across the Dutch East Indies, Allied troops encountered survivors who had endured an industrialized system of sexual exploitation. Less than a month after Myatka, on September 7, 1944, another significant documentation occurred in Shan, located in China's Yunnan province. U.S.-Chinese Allied forces liberated several Korean women during an assault on Japanese positions. Private Charles Hatfield of the 164th Signal Photo Company captured a photograph that would become a pivotal visual record of comfort women liberation. The image depicted 4 Korean women, one clearly pregnant, being escorted to safety by Chinese soldiers. Around the same time, Sergeant Edward Fay filmed motion picture footage of the rescue. These materials, now preserved in the U.S. National Archives, provided enduring visual evidence of the atrocities. The pregnant woman in the photo would later be identified as Park Young-sim, who would finally give public testimony about her ordeal at the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo in 2000, over half a century later. Military records for the original group of 24 Korean women liberated in Shan indicate that only 10 survived the ordeal. The remaining 14 had perished during bombings preceding the Allied attack. Documentation efforts were coordinated largely by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, established on September 19, 1942 under Colonel Sidney F. Masher. ATIS, which grew to nearly 4,000 personnel by 1945, primarily composed of Japanese Americans, was responsible for processing thousands of captured documents that revealed the bureaucratic underpinnings of Japan's sexual slavery system. Among the reports generated, Artist Research Report No. UF5, The Pursing 120, titled Amenities in the Japanese Armed Forces, submitted directly to General Douglas MacArthur, provided the most comprehensive Allied analysis of the Comfort Women system. The November 15, 1945 edition expanded the report to 42 pages from the original 22 in February, including annexes containing captured Japanese military regulations.
These records are preserved today in the U.S. National Archives under record groups 165, 331, 407, and 554, serving as a permanent archive of the systematic exploitation carried out during Japan's occupation across Asia. Initially, comfort stations were categorized under amusement brothels rather than being recognized as sites of war crimes. This classification reflected the prevailing understanding of the period, a perspective that would not be critically reassessed for decades. Surviving military regulations provide clear evidence of a highly organized system operating across the Pacific. For instance, the Huayu Comfort Station rules issued in Nanjing on March 6, 1939 prescribed exact schedules for medical examinations, detailed fee structures that varied according to the rank of the soldiers, designated hours of operation, and mandatory use of condoms. At the Mandalay Garrison headquarters, a set of 30 regulations formalized the operation of comfort stations. Women were officially registered as licensed prostitutes, yet these stations were subject to rigorous military supervision. Transport records further illustrate the bureaucratic precision. Army cargo vessels moved comfort women from Japan and Korea only with explicit permission from the Ministry of War. Rail transportation orders confirm that these women were transported in freight cars labeled as military supplies. Each transfer required multiple layers of authorization, the completion of triplicate forms, and official seals. Such documentation survived even when other records were destroyed, leaving a meticulous bureaucratic trail. The terminology in these documents consistently masked the reality of abuse. Phrases like special service personnel were euphemisms for sex slaves, and comfort facilities referred to locations where rape was systematically enforced. Medical services often entailed coerced abortions. The bureaucratic language framed systematic sexual violence as a form of entertainment, shaping perceptions of comfort women during the liberation period. Consequently, many survivors did not fit neatly into categories such as prisoners of war, civilian internees, or military personnel, leaving them in a legal and social limbo. The liberation of the Philippines from Japanese occupation between October 1944 and July 1945 revealed the extensive scope of this network. When the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division entered Manila on February 3, 1945, they moved rapidly to free 3,785 Allied civilian internees at Santo Tomas University. The troops traversed neighborhoods that had hosted comfort stations for over 3 years. According to records compiled by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, Manila alone contained 12 comfort stations and 5 brothels. Additional facilities were discovered throughout the Philippine archipelago. These included Bayanbong in North Luzon, Masbate in the Central Visayas, Iloilo on Panay Island, where 2 stations housed 12 to 16 and 10 to 11 women respectively, Cebu, Tacloban on Leyte with 9 Filipino women, Buwan on Leyte, Butuan on Mindanao with 3 women, Cagayan on Mindanao with 3 stations, and Davao, also on Mindanao, which held women of mixed nationalities. Urban combat during the month-long Battle of Manila, which lasted until March 3, 1945, saw the 37th Infantry Division confronting entrenched Japanese forces across the city. On February 17, IOM AOO of 1945, the 148th Infantry Regiment liberated the Philippine General Hospital and the University of the Philippines, freeing approximately 7,000 civilian internees. The liberation process exposed the extensive and systematized exploitation that had persisted under Japanese military oversight, highlighting the intersection of bureaucratic administration and sexual violence during the occupation.
During their operations in the Philippines, American troops systematically uncovered numerous facilities used for sexual exploitation in districts such as Malati, Binondo, and Quiapo. Documents seized from the headquarters of the Japanese 14th Area Army revealed that these operations were heavily profit-driven. Women confined to these facilities were compelled to pay for basic necessities including food, clothing, and medical care, with costs consistently exceeding what they could earn, effectively placing them in a cycle of debt servitude. All financial transactions were managed by military pay officers, and the women themselves were never given actual money. Payment records indicated that soldiers were charged according to their military rank, with privates paying 2 yen, non-commissioned officers 3 yen, and officers subject to special arrangements. Among those rescued was Maria Rosa L. Henson, born on December 5, 1927. Her liberation occurred earlier through the intervention of Filipino guerrilla fighters collaborating with American forces. Henson's ordeal began in February 1942 at age 14 when she was first assaulted by Japanese soldiers. By April 1943, she was coerced into serving as a comfort woman for 9 months. She was finally freed in January 1944, shortly before American forces returned to the Philippines. Henson later broke decades of silence, becoming the first Philippine woman to publicly recount her experiences in 1992. She subsequently became one of the initial beneficiaries of the Asian Women's Fund project in 1996. Her testimony has provided invaluable evidence regarding the inner workings of comfort stations in the Philippines and highlighted the role of local guerrilla forces in the rescue and liberation of enslaved women. The situation encountered by American forces during the Okinawa invasion, which commenced on April 1, 1945, was even more overwhelming. Intelligence reports had suggested the presence of a limited number of comfort stations, but the reality was far more extensive. Historical records document that over 145 such stations existed on the relatively small island, which measured only about 70 miles in length. During the Okinawa campaign, which involved both the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, comfort stations were identified in virtually every major town and military facility. Naha alone contained 17 former stations. Military intelligence indicated that the women found there included Koreans, Taiwanese, and Okinawans, some as young as 14. The rapid collapse of Japanese positions in certain areas led to unexpected and shocking discoveries. Near Shuri, the ancient capital of Okinawa, Marines from the 1st Division located cave complexes where Korean women had been concealed. These women had been misled into believing that capture by American forces would result in torture and cannibalism, a propaganda strategy employed by Japanese authorities to promote suicide over surrender. Some women had been issued hand grenades with instructions to take their own lives rather than be taken prisoner. The sheer volume of documentation uncovered on Okinawa quickly exceeded the translation capacity of available personnel. By May 1945, the Army Translation and Interpretation Service (ATIS) had deployed 3 full translation teams to process thousands of captured documents, all detailing the operations of comfort stations across the island. These records offered critical insight into the organized system of exploitation and the mechanisms employed to sustain it. The scale of bureaucratic oversight was staggering. Duty rosters indicated that during peak periods, individual women were compelled to provide sexual services to 30 to 40 men each day. Medical logs documented coerced abortions and sterilizations, while financial records demonstrated the military's tight economic grip over every part of the system. The Military Intelligence Service, MISAC, largely staffed by Nisei Japanese Americans, was instrumental in gathering evidence on comfort women and documenting the operations of these stations. During 1944, the so-called Merrill's Marauders, formerly the 5th 307 Composite Unit Provisional under Brigadier General Frank D. Merrill, operated deep behind Japanese lines in Burma. Their efforts were heavily dependent on 14 Nisei MIS translators, whose linguistic skills were essential in interrogating personnel captured from comfort stations. After this unit disbanded on August 10, 1944, the Mars Task Force, commanded by Brigadier General John P. Willey, assumed responsibility. This new formation included the 475th Infantry Regiment and the 124th Cavalry Regiment, each supported by teams of 12 Nisei language specialists who continued the liberation work in northern Burma. The translators faced extraordinary linguistic and cultural challenges. The women they encountered spoke a variety of languages, including Korean, Chinese, Tagalog, Indonesian, Dutch, and multiple regional dialects. Many Korean women had been prohibited from speaking their native tongue for so long that even communicating with Korean-speaking translators was difficult. Cultural norms surrounding modesty and trauma compounded the difficulties. Numerous women refused to speak with male translators about the sexual abuse they endured. Through meticulous examination of records, the translators uncovered the systemic racial hierarchies embedded in the comfort station system. Women were segregated by ethnicity, Koreans were classified as Class A, Chinese as Class B, and Southeast Asians as Class C. Facilities differed according to these classifications, with officer-only stations generally having fewer women who, paradoxically, endured even harsher treatment. The evidence revealed that sexual violence was administered systematically, aligned both with military rank and entrenched racial prejudice. The liberation of the Dutch East Indies, coinciding with Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, exposed yet another layer of exploitation: the enslavement of European women. Among them was January Ruffo Han, born in Java in 1923, who at age 21 had been forced into sexual servitude in 1944. She and 9 other Dutch women were removed from Ambarawa internment camp in February 1944 and confined in a comfort station at Serang for 4 months before being transferred to a camp in Batavia. They remained there until liberation came with the Japanese surrender in mid-August 1945. This documentation collectively paints a chilling portrait of the comfort women system, a meticulously organized machinery of sexual exploitation, codified by racial hierarchy, sustained through bureaucratic rigor, and dependent on linguistic and cultural intermediaries who painstakingly recorded the human cost of this abuse. She ended decades of silence with the publication of her memoir in 1994, titled 50 Years of Silence, and later testified before the United States Congress in 2007, offering precise and harrowing accounts of the organized system of sexual slavery imposed by the Japanese military during World War II. Following the Japanese surrender, British and Australian forces systematically uncovered comfort stations throughout Java. Australian naval units played a specific role in the repatriation of Indonesian women who had been held as comfort women, particularly from the Labuan region in Borneo. In West Java, the Bogor camp was constructed exclusively to house women coerced into military brothels. Meanwhile, Betawi camps served as centers for processing more than 10,500 women and children during post-liberation operations. When Dutch colonial forces returned to reclaim control of the territory, they initially suppressed information about comfort stations that had involved Dutch women. Official records were sealed under the justification of protecting the women's reputations, a decision that effectively delayed public recognition and justice for decades. Allied medical teams who examined liberated comfort women documented severe, long-term physical consequences. According to the United States Office of War Information Report number He-149, medical evaluations revealed widespread malnutrition, with average body weight losses around 32%, comparable to other populations who had experienced prolonged deprivation. Sexually transmitted infections were pervasive, with military medical reports noting particularly high incidences of syphilis and gonorrhea. Treatments often relied on toxic compounds such as salvin and arenamine, resulting in additional harm including infertility and other serious health complications. Medical personnel also recorded numerous cases of forced abortions, sterilization procedures, and extensive reproductive damage caused by repeated sexual assault. Many women were critically underweight, often between 60 to 70 pounds, when their normal body mass should have been between 100 and 120 pounds. Nutritional deficiency diseases including scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, and other conditions typically associated with concentration camps were widespread. While military doctors provided care using newly available sulfur-based medications and penicillin, psychiatric support for trauma was almost entirely absent due to the limited understanding of mental health in the 1940s. Doctors used terms like hysteria, melancholia, and nervous exhaustion to describe what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Official documents bore signatures of military physicians authorizing forced abortions. In one Philippine facility, records indicate that 15 women underwent such procedures in a single month. Sterilization operations were similarly documented at multiple sites. Collectively, these medical records reveal that comfort women were treated not as patients deserving care, but as instruments of war to be maintained for military purposes. The United States Army's 164th Signal Photo Company contributed a critical visual record. Photographers from the Signal Corps systematically captured images of liberated comfort stations across the Pacific, documenting the confined cubicles where women were held, standard-issue military bedding, examination tables, and containers of military-issued condoms. While these photographs were originally intended for intelligence purposes, they inadvertently preserved an unambiguous visual account of the infrastructure that facilitated systematic sexual abuse. Photographs taken over the decades revealed a striking uniformity in the design of so-called comfort stations. Across locations in the Philippines, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, these facilities consistently followed a similar layout. Existing structures were repurposed into a series of small compartments, each barely accommodating a single military cot, alongside shared washrooms and medical examination areas. Every image captured the meticulous, almost mechanical arrangement, highlighting the military's systematic approach to these operations. The photographers' work went beyond documenting buildings; they recorded the women themselves at the point of liberation. The images exposed profound physical suffering, extreme malnutrition, untreated wounds, and eyes reflecting deep, long-lasting psychological trauma. Despite efforts to maintain the women's dignity in these photographs, the visual record provided undeniable evidence of orchestrated abuse. After the war, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRA, founded in November 1943, spearheaded the enormous effort to return displaced populations to their homes. By 1946, UNRA employed 11,000 staff and managed hundreds of camps for displaced persons across territories formerly under occupation. During just May and June 1945, the Supreme turn of over 5.25 million individuals, averaging 80,000 people per day. Yet, women who had been forced into sexual slavery were treated as part of the general displaced population without specialized support. Their legal and social status was ambiguous. They were neither prisoners of war, civilian detainees, nor military personnel, which affected everything from medical attention to transport priorities. This bureaucratic gray area left many women with only the bare minimum of aid, despite the severe trauma they endured. Some women were unable or unwilling to go back to their original homes. Specific cases illustrate this predicament. Ribongi, a Korean woman, stayed in Okinawa after liberation, initially classified as stateless under U.S. military administration. She later became an undocumented resident when Okinawa reverted to Japanese control in 1972. Korean women living in China often lost their native language due to prolonged isolation, and some entered marriages locally as a means of survival and protection. Organizations such as the American Red Cross, which counted 7.5 million volunteers and 39,000 paid staff at its peak in 1945, provided non-medical aid, including comfort items and psychological first aid through initiatives like the Grey Ladies Program. Nevertheless, cultural and linguistic barriers limited the effectiveness of these interventions. The primary emphasis remained on rapid repatriation rather than addressing the profound emotional and physical scars inflicted on these women. Cultural stigma presented yet another barrier to reintegration. In Confucian societies, female sexual purity was intimately tied to family honor. Women who had been sexually violated were often seen as bringing shame upon their families, leading many families to conceal the truth or even pretend their daughters had died. In Catholic Philippines, survivors of sexual abuse frequently faced social exclusion. Similarly, Indonesian Muslim communities struggled to accept women who had endured enforced sexual violence. Post-war legal proceedings reflected a similar failure to adequately address these crimes. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which ran from April 29, 1946 to November 12, 1948, called 419 witnesses and admitted 4,336 exhibits, yet only referenced forced prostitution once in its final judgment. This limited mention concerned the city of Guilin in China, where Japanese forces had initially recruited women under the guise of labor for factories, only to coerce them into sexual servitude. More substantive legal precedents emerged in Dutch colonial courts. The Batavia Temporary Court-Martial, for example, heard 4 of 171 cases specifically related to forced prostitution between August 1946 and December 1949. In the case known as the Semarang Incident, the court sentenced Army Major Okada to death on February 14, 1948, while 11 other military personnel received prison terms ranging from 2 to 20 years for compelling approximately 35 Dutch women from concentration camps into comfort stations. Further revelations came in April 2007 when researchers Yoshimi Yoshiaki and Hyapumi Hayashi uncovered archival documents from the Tokyo trials. These files contained 7 official records indicating that the Tokhet Thai Naval Military Police had forced women into frontline brothels across China, Indochina, and Indonesia. Such evidence underscores the organized and widespread nature of sexual exploitation during the war, a reality that remained largely unacknowledged in mainstream post-war justice processes. For 6 decades, crucial documents related to wartime sexual slavery remained unexamined and unprosecuted. This prolonged inaction effectively communicated that the crimes committed against women in the comfort system were not treated as a serious offense. The lack of accountability denied survivors both acknowledgement and justice, allowing those responsible to evade consequences. Silence dominated for 46 years following the end of World War II, leaving survivors in isolation. That changed on August 14, 1991, when Kim Hak-soon courageously became the first former comfort woman to come forward publicly. A press conference broke decades of silence, paving the way for other survivors across Asia to share their experiences. While precise details of her release are scant in historical records, her decision to speak out initiated a chain reaction, validating decades-old evidence collected by American forces. In January 1992, Japanese historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki uncovered pivotal documents at the National Institute for Defense Studies within Japan's Defense Agency archives. These materials offered the earliest concrete evidence of the Japanese military's direct orchestration of the comfort women system. Among the findings were military directives establishing comfort stations and operational regulations showing active military supervision. Notably, the 1932 diary of Okinawa Saburo, a senior officer in the Shanghai Expeditionary Force, described the setup of the first comfort station during the Shanghai incident. These archival discoveries substantiated survivor testimonies, confirming that the system was a deliberate military initiative rather than the actions of isolated units. Following Kim Hak-soon's disclosure, other survivors began publicly recounting their experiences. Yong-soo Lee, abducted as a teenager from Chu, Korea, provided testimony to the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee in 2007. Alongside 2 other survivors, her account contributed to the adoption of House Resolution 121, which called on Japan to fully acknowledge and take responsibility for the Comfort Women program. Another notable figure, Park Young-sim, the pregnant girl immortalized in the widely circulated Sunshine photograph, testified at the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo in 2000. She recounted being taken at 17 and enduring 3 years of sexual enslavement. In 2003, Park visited the Nanjing Lièx Comfort Station, the first site where she had been held before being relocated to Sean, providing further documentation of her ordeal. Il Chul Kang, forcibly taken to China in 1943, could not return to Korea after the war and remained in China as a nurse until 2000. She frequently traveled to the United States to raise awareness about the comfort women system. Her artwork, Girls Being Burnt, later inspired the feature film Spirit's Homecoming, drawing attention to the enduring displacement and trauma caused by the system. The 1990 seconds and early 2000 seconds saw a surge in archival discoveries worldwide, shedding new light on the scope of the Comfort Women Network. Declassified American intelligence included photographs of comfort stations across the Pacific, medical reports documenting systematic abuse, and operational records demonstrating the military infrastructure supporting sexual slavery. Between 2014 and 2015, Chinese archives released over 90 documents from the Quanong Army Military Police Corps, revealing detailed financial records from puppet regime banks in Manchuria. These materials confirmed that the Japanese army directly funded the acquisition of comfort women and meticulously tracked payments for personnel procurement. Together, these testimonies and archival revelations over decades transformed the historical understanding of the comfort women system, establishing it as an organized, state-sponsored program rather than isolated wartime misconduct. Research conducted by Professor Su Jilang estimated that around 200,000 women from China were coerced into serving in comfort stations, representing roughly 36% of all women subjected to this system. These facilities were not confined to a single region. Instead, they spanned an extensive network across East and Southeast Asia, including Japan, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma, New Guinea, Hong Kong, Macau, French Indochina, Korea, and Taiwan. This geographic distribution underscores the enormous scale and reach of the comfort women system. A closer look at the demographic composition reveals a rigidly racialized hierarchy. Approximately 51.8% were Korean, 36% Chinese, and 12.2% Japanese, with the remainder composed of women from the Philippines. The system was not chaotic or ad hoc. It operated as a highly organized military structure. High-ranking officers issued formal orders for station establishment, regional commanders formulated operational plans, local military police ensured compliance, and military physicians conducted regular health inspections. Perhaps the most harrowing evidence of the system's cruelty were the so-called disposal orders discovered at multiple sites. These directives, issued as Allied forces advanced, instructed military personnel to eliminate comfort women to prevent them from testifying about wartime atrocities. Massacre sites across the Philippines and other regions corroborate that these orders were executed. In Mapaniki village, for instance, on November 23, 1944, Japanese soldiers attempted to kill comfort women ahead of the approaching American forces. Comparable incidents were reported across the Pacific as Japanese units retreated, revealing a deliberate strategy to silence witnesses. Historians estimate that around 75% of comfort women perished, a figure reflecting both extreme living conditions and intentional killings to avoid exposure of war crimes. Japanese authorities also employed psychological manipulation as a key element of control. Comfort women were repeatedly warned that Allied soldiers would torture or even cannibalize them. British observers in Burma noted that Korean women were genuinely shocked to learn that the British posed no such threat. This fear was deliberately cultivated to discourage escape and, in some cases, to encourage suicide rather than capture. Numerous testimonies describe women being handed grenades and instructed to take their own lives instead of falling into Allied hands. The long-lasting psychological impact of this indoctrination complicated liberation efforts. Many women initially hid from liberators, attempted suicide, or remained in the stations even after Japanese forces had abandoned them, unable to believe that the arriving Allied soldiers were allies rather than threats. By late 1945, as Allied occupation expanded across Japan itself, investigators uncovered evidence that the comfort women system had extended into the Japanese home islands. Military documents revealed that comfort stations operated within Japan, servicing training facilities and military bases. Even more unsettling was the discovery that Japanese authorities had prepared similar arrangements for incoming occupation forces. The Recreation and Amusement Association, created prior to the American arrival, had recruited thousands of Japanese women as specialized entertainers for occupation troops, highlighting the systematic planning behind the exploitation of women. This historical record demonstrates not only the vast geographical reach and organizational sophistication of the comfort women system, but also its deliberate strategies of terror, suppression, and psychological manipulation. The systematic killing, intimidation, and conditioning of women reveal the Japanese military's awareness of guilt and their concerted efforts to prevent the exposure of these wartime crimes. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, General Douglas MacArthur swiftly issued a ban on the exploitation of women by the military, motivated by both ethical concerns and public health considerations. However, the degree to which this ban was enforced varied across different regions and units. Archival records from the U.S. Navy reveal that, during the war, the Japanese military had meticulously tracked statistics on comfort women. These wartime documents, once analyzed, exposed the enormous scale of the system. The evidence was striking in its bureaucratic thoroughness. Registration forms, scheduled medical examinations, financial ledgers, and administrative reports all pointed to sexual slavery being systematically embedded within military operations at every level. One major gap in the historical record lies in the near-total absence of first-hand accounts from the American soldiers who came upon these women during liberation. Collections such as the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, the National World War II Museum Archives, and various military historical repositories offer scant material reflecting the perspectives of liberating troops. Several reasons explain this lack of documentation. Much of the Japanese military's paperwork was deliberately destroyed at the end of the conflict. Discussions about comfort women remained culturally and socially taboo for decades after 1945. Furthermore, American military records tended to prioritize strategic and tactical operations over social or humanitarian encounters. Many comfort women had perished during the war, while others were killed by retreating Japanese forces before Allied troops could reach them. The silence of U.S. military personnel is understandable in context. Soldiers were confronted with atrocities of an unimaginable scale and had no precedent or formal guidance for addressing systematic sexual enslavement. While procedures existed for the liberation and care of prisoners of war and civilian internees, there was no official protocol for dealing with organized sexual violence. This institutional void contributed to the long-term invisibility of comfort women's experiences. From the end of World War II until the early 1992s, these women remained largely absent from the historical narrative. Compensation programs after the war recognized only prisoners of war and civilian internees. Comfort women, classified as neither, were excluded from reparations and legal recognition. Silence on the issue was maintained by multiple actors. The Japanese government destroyed evidence and denied culpability. Allied nations classified sensitive documents and avoided probing uncomfortable questions, and many Asian governments prioritized economic reconstruction over advocacy for victims. The first breakthroughs came through the courage of survivors. Kim Ha-kun's testimony in 1991 marked a turning point. This momentum culminated in the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal in 2000, which gave 64 survivors from 8 nations the opportunity to provide formal statements under oath. Although the tribunal lacked legal authority, it created a detailed and enduring record that brought decades of hidden suffering into the public domain. The United States further acknowledged these injustices through House Resolution 121 in 2007. The resolution formally recognized the hardships endured by comfort women and called on Japan to take clear and unequivocal responsibility for its military's coercion of women into sexual slavery. This recognition, arriving more than 6 decades after liberation, underscored the extraordinary length of time required for these survivors' experiences to move from obscurity to official acknowledgement. The decades-long silence, institutional oversight, and eventual public recognition together tell a story of hidden suffering, delayed justice, and the eventual courage of survivors breaking through barriers of memory and denial. Recent retrospective research on survivors of Japan's comfort women system indicates that nearly 90% of these women experienced PTSD at some point in their lives, with around 65% still exhibiting symptoms decades after the war. These figures far surpass PTSD prevalence among Holocaust survivors, which stands at approximately 39%, underscoring the extreme psychological toll inflicted. While such trauma was largely unrecognized or misunderstood by military medical personnel in 1945, modern studies confirm the enduring mental health impact. The organized and systematic nature of the Comfort Women program becomes clear when examining its operational scope. From 1932 to 1945, the system functioned across the entire Japanese empire, following uniform regulations implemented in thousands of facilities. Military logistics managed the transportation of women, the provision of medical services, and financial oversight, while hierarchical and racial structures were embedded in the operational rules. The sheer scale and precision of this network reveal a form of industrialized sexual enslavement executed with bureaucratic and military efficiency. Paradoxically, the very thoroughness of the system, its detailed documentation, standardized protocols, and widespread implementation provided the evidence that would eventually prove its existence, despite decades of denial. Efforts to destroy records were largely unsuccessful. Reports from military translators, photographs taken by Signal Corps units, intelligence files, and medical records all survived, forming an archival record that could not be erased. When survivors eventually came forward, their accounts corresponded closely with these once classified records, confirming long-hidden truths. Every regulation captured, every comfort station photographed, and every translated document contributed to an incontrovertible historical record. The bureaucratic rigor with which the Japanese military conducted these operations inadvertently documented one of the most extensive and systematic war crimes of World War II. Routine military documentation, originally intended for operational purposes, became enduring proof of atrocity. The American soldiers who first encountered comfort stations likely had no idea that their daily duties taking photographs, filing reports, and translating documents would one day underpin decades-long demands for recognition and justice. By 2024, fewer than 20 Korean survivors of the comfort women system remained alive. Their testimonies, corroborated by American military documentation collected during liberation, constitute unassailable evidence of systematic abuse. Statues commemorating comfort women now stand worldwide as silent witnesses to suffering that had been long ignored. The experiences documented by Allied forces in 1944 to 1945 demonstrate not only the scope of Japanese wartime crimes but also the meticulous planning behind them. Standardized regulations, organized transportation, medical support, and financial management confirm that these were deliberate, state-sanctioned policies rather than incidental wartime excesses. The delayed acknowledgement of survivors' experiences reflected multiple institutional and societal failures. Military structures were unprepared for the recognition of sexual crimes on such a scale. Cultural taboos silenced victims. Political priorities favored stability over justice, and entrenched gender biases minimized sexual violence. These systemic failures exacerbated survivors' trauma, extending its impact across decades. Yet, despite these obstacles, the archival evidence survived. Signal Corps photographs, intelligence officer reports, and medical documentation collectively verify what survivors insisted was true all along. For the women liberated by American forces in 1944 to 1945, physical freedom did not immediately translate into psychological relief. Years of dehumanization, shaming, and coercion had instilled a belief that their lives were worthless and their experiences incommunicable. Liberation challenged these deeply internalized notions, creating psychological dissonance that many struggled to reconcile. Nevertheless, the military records from numbered reports to ATIS, translated documents, and Signal Corps imagery offer incontrovertible proof of the systematic atrocities they endured. The very bureaucratic infrastructure meant to facilitate exploitation inadvertently became the foundation for historical truth. As the last survivors age, their testimonies gain even greater weight, reinforced by surviving documentation. These women, who initially struggled to grasp the reality of their liberation, illustrate a broader truth. Genuine freedom entails not only release from captivity, but also acknowledgement of the harm suffered. Healing requires recognition, validation, and societal acceptance. The decades-long pursuit of justice by comfort women is an extension of the liberation process initiated by American soldiers. The systematic documentation collected during World War II now serves as a permanent record, transforming personal testimonies into historical fact. These accounts reveal a vital lesson. Liberation is a continuous process, encompassing physical rescue, social recognition, and the restoration of dignity. The comfort women's story compels reflection on war, gendered violence, and justice, demonstrating that freedom alone is insufficient without acknowledgement, accountability, and the affirmation of human worth.